Welcome back. Today we're looking at Confucianism and Humanism, Chapter 4 of the World History Workbook. And we will look at the pages 93 through 99, and then in a second video look at Confucianism. Humanism is really introduced very briefly, and then in the next chapter, humanism we look at humanism more deeply and in greater detail. But just to introduce some of the major terms of humanism, and then to discuss Confucianism a little bit more in depth, to show contrasting intellectual traditions. And I chose these two traditions because they're some of the most enduring and some of the grandest, and in today's world, some of the most influential. Certainly two of the most influential traditions in the world are humanism and Confucianism, and define basically humanism defines American tradition and American law, American practice, and to some extent American culture, and also European, and not to mention the constitutions and much of the behavior and educational systems of Japan and Argentina and Korea and much of West Africa and so on, Israel. I mean, a lot of the world follows basically a humanist principle in its law. But then the Confucianism has not gone away either, and both of these traditions have endured for off and on, and with some uneven application and varying interpretations for thousands of years. And humanism, of course, more influential in the last 500 years than it was in the previous 500, but also dates back to, in some respects, to ancient Greece. So the first part of this chapter, pages 93 and 94, and then Project 18, really just introduces these terms. And the terms are really tricky, because particularly with the word freedom, it's my perception that freedom is the most abused word in the American English language. And I think that it needs to be introduced right away. Humanism is based on freedom. If there's a stereotype of a humanist, it's like a French revolutionary screaming for égalité, fraternité, and liberté. And the same with a stereotype of an American who's screaming for freedom. But then freedom gets packaged and marketed and bought and sold and means a lot of different things, and comes to mean anarchy to a lot of people, or comes to mean I can do whatever I want, or however I assert my power is okay because I'm free, or I'm free to think whatever I want, or do whatever I want, or treat other people however I want. And that's really not the humanist principle at all. That was never the principle. So I think that introducing a definition for these first two projects on this chapter is very important to a lot of students, to hear these terms used and offered with maybe a more solid historical definition and a more solid historical backing, and also a backing of reason, that these terms are used in this book in ways that are defensible, in ways that can be supported and not only historically, but also can be supported rationally and logically. It makes no logical sense to build a society based on anarchy, or build a society based on everybody doing whatever they feel like or believing whatever they want. That makes no sense. You can't possibly, nobody can construct a professional, progressive, scientific society on that principle. So I think these terms need to be sort of reintroduced, but students often intuit that there is something more to the principles of freedom, individuality, and reason than what they have often heard. So the second paragraph on page 93 of the chapter Confucianism and Humanism, it offers a definition. Humanism refers to a trust in human reason, the scientific method, and individual liberty and equality. I think for in classroom discussions, and also in the video assignments that I asked my students to do when I taught this class remotely, I really reduced that sentence to say that humanism is the principle or the idea that humans are born free to reason as individuals. So those three elements, I think, are the most important, and really covered the others. I mean, that equality is a logical conclusion to that was so unevenly applied from the ancient Greeks to the Renaissance to the modern world, that equality, we sort of set it aside and then discuss it later, because it's a logical conclusion. It's not one of the original precepts. In fact, the ancient Greeks were pretty clear. They did not believe that men and women were equal. By nature, that men and women were not equal, that men had the ability to reason, men had the ability to rise above and develop civilization, to develop philosophy and so on. Women simply did not. I mean, the Greeks are really just stunningly misogynistic, right? And this the ancient Greek society, the herald of democracy, so-called, really oppressed women and segregated women from men in a way that puts shame to most modern segregation systems. I think that needs to be emphasized to a lot of students, that these three principles, freedom, individuality, and reason, have been applied differently and have been understood differently, and not always logically, not always fairly, both in the writing of laws and in the construction of society and so on. And this is one of the themes of this section. So I think freedom is an important term to begin to discuss with this material. And reason also. The term citizen is also introduced, and a very handy definition of a citizen is a person who governs herself or governs himself or has the ability to govern himself. This is what the ancient Greeks taught. Then there's some discussion of Socrates, and there's a short reading from a Socratic dialogue in the back that's instructive. Socrates trusts his students' reason, an inherent ability to reason, with reason meaning discern between correct and incorrect. And this may have a moral extension, and so to discern between right and wrong. But Socrates believed, and I think most humanists believe, that human beings are born with an inherent ability to recognize contradiction, to recognize logic, to recognize rational thought, and to draw conclusions that are correct. And but they need to be free to do that. They need to be free to reason in order to arrive at correct conclusions, not simply be told things or bossed around or pushed around. So page 94, with Project 18, Socrates and Humanism, I simply ask students to read this passage and to explain how the Socratic method is humanist. And the answer is that Socrates trusted that his students need to be free to reason and that they need to do their own work. Then page 97 leads up to Project 19 and introduces the application of humanism as a political system. And the application of humanism really is democracy. I mean, a society built on humanist principles educates its citizenry and then gives its citizenry the ability to govern itself. And not that the government or that the head of state or that the society awards human beings their freedom, or that the government or the president or something awards or grants people the ability to reason. People are born with that, according to the humanist principle. This is something that we all have from birth. But the government then protects those rights. This is the democratic principle. And to do that, they need to govern fairly, the laws need to be fair, and that means equal, that the laws need to be equal. So the project on page 19 then asks these questions and asks students to look at themselves and to look at their own societies and to consider some of the larger historical problems. And they can do this. These are not projects that are beyond a student's ability. Number one, why can inclusion in the public process be used as a measurement of democracy? Simply gets students to consider the idea of inclusion, which I'm sure they have considered many times in their lives in various capacities and conversations. Well, here they're connecting it to democracy, and the principle behind this question is that democracy can be measured. How democratic is that society? And it can be measured by the degree of inclusion, the degree of equality, the degree of reason. Number two is that humanists to include women in the public process. It's a very leading question, and the answer is obvious. But this still comes up. It's not that there aren't people who believe still today, that women should not hold office because they're not always capable of reason. As nonsensical as that is, I think it's healthy to articulate the fallacy of that argument and to argue against it. Number three, measure the degree to which the United States is a democratic society. This is very helpful for students studying in the United States to look at the American tradition and how democratic was ancient Athens. The answer to this is a little problematic. Some students will argue, I think fairly, that ancient Athens wasn't democratic at all, a society that excluded such a large proportion of its population, more than half of its population. I think it's important to point out in those discussions that ancient Athenian slavery was very different. It's a different institution from modern American slavery. But it's still slavery. And those people were still excluded, and people were still bought and sold. It's a healthy reminder about who is included and who is excluded from American society, and then to ask how democratic is that society. So that's just the introduction. That's the introduction to humanism. And then after Confucianism, when we get to chapter 5, the text looks deeper at the humanist traditions and follows humanist developments through the last 500 years, 400 or 500 years. I hope you enjoy these pages. I think it's a very helpful introduction to the terms and the basic principle, just to introduce this idea into the vocabulary of students, and also to show that humanism takes a bad rap as a word, and I think it's often badly misrepresented. People use the term secular humanist, and I believe that this has some application, but it's not the same as simply humanist. I'll see you next time.